For most of his life, Steve Perry didn't just sing songs, he was the sound. That voice didn't come from technical perfection or studio tricks. It came from strain, longing, vulnerability. A voice that sounded like it was always reaching for something just out of grasp. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, it became inseparable from Journey's identity. One sustained note was enough. You didn't need the band's name. You didn't need the song title. You knew who it was immediately. And when a voice becomes that recognizable, it stops belonging only to the man who carries it. It becomes public property, cultural memory, something people expect to still exist, even if the person behind it can't. That's where Steve Perry's story quietly turns. Contrary to the simplified narrative, Perry didn't step away from Journey because he lost his passion for music. Verified interviews over the years show a more complicated truth. By the mid-1990s, Perry was dealing with severe and chronic hip pain. Touring became physically punishing, standing night after night, traveling constantly, performing at full intensity. It all came at a cost his body was no longer willing to pay. Doctors recommended surgery, time off, a slower pace. But Journey wasn't built for slowing down. The band wanted to move forward. The machine required momentum, and Perry, faced with both physical fear and emotional exhaustion, hesitated. According to confirmed accounts, he wasn't sure he wanted surgery if it meant returning to a lifestyle that had already taken so much from him. That hesitation mattered. Journey waited, but not forever. Eventually, the unspoken reality became unavoidable. Either Steve Perry returned fully, or the band would find a way to exist without him. When Perry didn't commit, Journey moved on. At the time, many fans believed it was temporary, a pause, a break that would eventually correct itself. After all, how could Journey exist without that voice? For a while it didn't. Then, in 2007, everything changed. Journey introduced a new lead singer to the world, Arnel Pineda. Almost immediately, the reaction was disbelief. Not because Arnel was good, but because he was uncannily familiar. The range was there, the tone, the phrasing, even the emotional peaks, the way notes cracked just enough to sound human. This wasn't reinvention, it was replication. Fans around the world reacted with awe. Videos went viral. Comment sections filled with the same stunned phrase repeated endlessly. He sounds just like Steve Perry. For the audience, it felt like a miracle. Proof that something thought irreplaceable had somehow been restored. Journey could tour again. The songs could live again. The experience could continue. But for Steve Perry, the experience was something else entirely. Hearing someone else sing your songs is inevitable. Every artist faces that eventually. Covers are flattering. Tributes are expected. Time moves on. But hearing someone else sing like you, so closely that even devoted fans struggle to tell the difference, introduces a psychological problem most artists never have to confront. It's not replacement, it's duplication. Steve Perry has never publicly attacked Arnel Pineda. That's a verified fact. In interviews, he has praised Arnel's talent and acknowledged his ability. There is no confirmed quote where Perry calls him a clone. That language belongs to fans, commentators, and online discourse, not to Perry himself. But what Perry has said is revealing. In verified statements, Steve Perry described watching Journey with a new singer as surreal. That word matters. Surreal doesn't mean angry. It doesn't mean bitter. It means unreal, like watching something that shouldn't exist yet clearly does. It suggests disorientation, a subtle fracture between what your mind expects and what your eyes are seeing. Imagine sitting somewhere quietly, watching a crowd rise to its feet as your songs fill an arena. Imagine hearing your voice, the same phrasing, the same emotional delivery, but realizing it isn't coming from you. You're not gone, you're not dead, and yet you're no longer required. Psychologically, that creates a very specific kind of pain. Steve Perry didn't respond with outrage. He didn't attempt to reclaim the spotlight. He didn't challenge the band's decision publicly. Instead, he did something far more telling. He went silent for years. That silence wasn't accidental. It wasn't irrelevance, and it wasn't indifference. It was distance. The kind someone creates when confronting something they can't emotionally reconcile. In psychology, identity loss doesn't always show up as anger. Often, it shows up as withdrawal, a quiet step back, a refusal to compete with a version of yourself that has been removed from your control. Steve Perry didn't just lose a band. He lost exclusivity over the one thing that had always defined him. His voice continued to travel the world without him. His songs continued to ignite crowds without him. His legacy continued uninterrupted. And that's a difficult thing to process for any artist, especially one whose presence had always been inseparable from the sound itself. Fans debated endlessly. Some embraced the continuation. Others felt conflicted. Many asked the same question over and over. How does Steve Perry really feel about this? The verified record suggests something deeper than resentment. It suggests displacement. Journey no longer needed him to exist as Journey. The world no longer waited for his return. And slowly, Steve Perry transitioned from being the center of his own story to being an observer of it, watching from a distance as his musical identity lived on, perfectly intact, without his participation. That realization doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in gradually. And once it does, it changes how you see everything that comes after. Because when the thing that made you no longer requires your presence, you're left with a question that has no easy answer. For Steve Perry, the strangest part wasn't that Journey continued without him. It was how easily it happened. There was no long public mourning, no extended silence from the world, no sense that something essential had been lost forever. Instead, the music resumed. The tours sold out. The applause returned, right on cue. And the voice was still there. Psychologically, that creates a unique fracture, because replacement implies absence, duplication implies redundancy, and redundancy is far harder to live with. Steve Perry had spent decades being told his voice was singular, unrepeatable, the thing no one else could touch. That belief wasn't just ego. It was reinforced by fans, critics, producers, and the industry itself. His sound was treated as a miracle, a lightning strike, until suddenly it wasn't. Verified accounts show that Perry remained largely quiet during Journey's resurgence with Arnel Pineda. He didn't insert himself into the narrative. He didn't correct fans. He didn't reclaim space that had already moved on. That restraint is important, because people who feel truly replaced don't always fight. Often, they retreat, especially when fighting would mean confronting an uncomfortable truth, that the world has adapted. In interviews years later, Perry spoke carefully about Journey's continued success. His words were measured. He congratulated the band. He acknowledged the fans. He never framed the situation as theft or betrayal. But absence can be as revealing as accusation. There's a psychological concept known as identity foreclosure. when a person's sense of self becomes so tightly bound to one role that losing control over it leaves them unsure how to exist outside of it. For Steve Perry, the role wasn't just singer, it was that singer, the voice people waited for. And suddenly, waiting was no longer necessary. The songs sounded the same, the emotional peaks landed the same, the audience response mirrored the past. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it likely felt like erasure. There is no verified statement where Perry describes feeling betrayed. That word is often applied by fans, not by Perry himself. But emotional betrayal doesn't always require malicious intent. Sometimes it's simply the realization that loyalty has limits, and that even irreplaceable things can be replicated if the demand is strong enough. Steve Perry didn't just step away from Journey physically. Over time, he stepped away emotionally. For years, he avoided the spotlight almost entirely. Albums went unwritten, interviews were rare, public appearances were minimal. This wasn't a man chasing relevance. It was a man protecting himself from a version of reality that felt deeply disorienting. Because how do you return to a space where your absence has already been solved? Rumors began circulating during this period, and it's important to separate them from verified fact. There were unconfirmed fan theories suggesting Perry felt humiliated by how closely Arnel matched his sound. These claims have never been substantiated by direct quotes or reliable interviews. They remain speculation, reflections of how audiences imagined Perry must feel, not confirmed evidence of his internal state. What is verified is that Perry described watching Journey as emotionally complex, not painful in the dramatic sense, but unsettling. That distinction matters. Pain suggests injury. Unsettling suggests destabilization. It's the difference between being hurt and having your internal map rewritten. Steve Perry had lived for decades with a certain understanding of his place in the world. That understanding was built on the belief that some things could not be replaced, only remembered. Journey's continuation challenged that belief, and the challenge didn't come from a weaker imitation. It came from someone who honored the original so precisely that the difference almost disappeared. For fans, that was a gift. For Perry, it blurred the line between legacy and loss. There's another psychological element at play here: auditory identity. For vocalists especially, the voice isn't just an instrument. It's an extension of the self. Hearing it reproduced externally, without your consent, control, or presence, can feel like watching part of your body operate independently. You're still alive, still breathing, still capable of speaking. But the version of you the world recognizes is no longer attached to your physical self. That's where the ghost sensation begins, even if Perry never used that exact word publicly. You become a living echo. Steve Perry eventually returned to music in limited ways. His solo work re-emerged years later. He spoke more openly about love, loss, and time. But notably, he didn't try to reclaim Journey. He didn't position himself as the missing piece that needed restoring. Instead, he framed his return as personal, not corrective. That choice suggests acceptance, but not necessarily peace. Because acceptance doesn't erase what came before. It simply acknowledges that fighting it would cost more than it gives back. Journey's songs will always be tied to Steve Perry. That fact hasn't changed. But the experience of those songs, the live, communal, present-tense version, now belongs to a different era. And Steve Perry knows it. The world didn't stop to wait for him to heal. It didn't pause while he decided who he wanted to be next. It kept listening. And sometimes, the hardest part isn't being replaced. It's realizing you were never as indispensable as you were led to believe. That realization doesn't shatter loudly. It settles quietly. And once it does, it changes how you hear everything, including your own voice. By the time Steve Perry finally stepped back into public view, the world had already decided who he was without asking him. He wasn't the missing voice anymore. He wasn't the question mark. He was the past, preserved, respected, but no longer required for the present to function. That realization didn't come in a single moment. It arrived slowly, through distance, through watching, through hearing his songs echo back to him from a place he no longer occupied. When Perry released new solo material years later, it wasn't framed as a comeback. That word implies unfinished business. Instead, it felt more like a conversation he was finally ready to have. With himself, not the industry. Verified interviews from this period show a man more reflective than resentful. He spoke about love, about loss, about time slipping away faster than expected. He acknowledged Journey's continued success without positioning himself as its missing soul. That choice matters. Because if Steve Perry truly felt replaced in the simple sense, this would have been the moment to say so, to reclaim narrative control, to remind the world who came first. He didn't. Instead, he did something far more revealing. He let the duplication exist without contesting it. Psychologically, that suggests a painful but deliberate acceptance that fighting the continuation of his voice would only deepen the wound. That arguing ownership over something the world had already embraced would trap him in a role he no longer wanted to inhabit. Steve Perry didn't lose his voice. He lost exclusivity over its meaning. And once that happens, the relationship between an artist and their legacy changes permanently. The songs still belong to him historically. That's undeniable. His phrasing, his emotional imprint, his original performances are embedded into the recordings forever. But the living experience of those songs, the thing that breathes and evolves in front of crowds, moved on without him. That's not betrayal in the dramatic sense. It's something quieter. It's obsolescence without erasure, and that distinction is brutal. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing you are still loved, but no longer necessary. That your contribution is honored, but no longer central. That your absence doesn't cause collapse. For someone whose identity was built around being irreplaceable, that realization forces a reckoning. Who are you when the thing that defined you keeps existing without you? Steve Perry answered that question not with protest, but with withdrawal. He didn't try to outsing the past. He didn't compete with the present. He chose to exist outside of both. And in doing so, he reclaimed something smaller, but more survivable, his humanity. Fans still debate the situation endlessly. Some frame it as unfair, others see it as inevitable. Many still use words like clone, projecting their own discomfort onto the narrative. But projection fills gaps left by silence. And Steve Perry's silence was intentional. There is no verified evidence that he felt hatred toward Arnel Pineda, no proof of jealousy, no documented bitterness. What exists instead is something harder to categorize, a sustained emotional distance from a version of himself that no longer belonged to him. That distance wasn't cowardice, it was self-preservation. Because continuing to engage would have meant reliving the fracture again and again, hearing his own sound detached from his body. watching crowds respond to something he once controlled, but now only recognized. In psychology, this is known as identity decoupling, the process of separating who you are from what you do when the two can no longer coexist without pain. Steve Perry decoupled. He let Journey be Journey without him. He let his voice live where it was needed. And he stepped away from the version of himself the world expected him to remain forever. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. Acceptance doesn't erase loss. It simply acknowledges it without resistance. There's a reason Steve Perry rarely revisits that era in detail. Not because he's ashamed, but because revisiting it would require re-entering a space where his presence is no longer required to validate the sound. And that's a hard room to walk into. In the end, Steve Perry didn't lose to a replacement. He didn't lose to time. And he didn't lose to another singer. He lost to continuity, to the realization that music, once released into the world, no longer belongs to its creator in the way it once did, that it can be preserved, replicated, and continued, even when the original source steps away. For some artists, that's comforting. For others, it's devastating. Steve Perry chose not to dramatize it, not to weaponize it, not to turn it into a public grievance. He chose silence. And in that silence, there's something deeply human. Because sometimes the most painful thing isn't being replaced. It's hearing yourself live on, perfectly intact, while realizing the world no longer needs you to make the sound you gave it. You're still alive, still breathing, still here. And yet, the echo continues without you. That's not a betrayal you can fight. It's one you learn to live beside. If stories like this matter to you, the quiet moments artists never explain, the parts that don't fit the headlines, subscribe to RetroWaves, because the most important chapters aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones that happen after the music fades.